In India, 13-fold. 13-fold. In the cotton areas. They of course said we are doing an absolutely accurate breeding. They don't even know what they're doing. And since I realize most people don't know what a GMO actually is, this is what it is. You take a plant that has been evolved through conventional breeding, a corn of a particular kind, a hybrid corn. You take the cells of that plant, put it into a petri dish. You take out a gene from a bacterium which produces a toxin. You shoot it with a gene gun into the cells. It's like shooting blindfold because you don't know where it's landed. 90% of the time it doesn't get absorbed. To separate the cells that absorb the new gene from those that did not, they add an antibiotic resistance marker. So when they pour the antibiotic onto that petri dish, the cells that didn't get the gene die, and the cells that got the gene live on. But like in any living system, any life form likes to be itself. You know? When we do organ transplants, there's a natural rejection, and that's why all kinds of hormones are given. All kinds of injections are given when you have a transplant. In this case, besides the fact that they've taken a poison producing gene from a soil bacterium in the case of Bt toxin, and a similar gene in the case of herbicide resistance, then they've added an antibiotic resistance marker, and then to make it express itself, they add a virulent virus promoter. Nobody has looked at what these three lethal genes do together and what they do when we eat it as food. But there are some experiments that have been done in Europe more than anywhere else in the world. The first was very, very important. Let me backtrack a bit. So because I woke up to how genetic engineering was linked to ownership of seed, I started to work on this issue. Besides saving seeds, I started to work on the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the UN treaty to protect species diversity. And we put into this treaty an article, Article 19.3, to say these new life forms are going to have impact on biodiversity and this should be studied. This is called the Biosafety Article. We now have a protocol, and I was a member of the first UN committee to shape this protocol. Globally, there's an international law on biosafety. But President Bush Sr. walked out of Rio in 1992
He did.
and said, I will not sign this treaty because it will affect the profits of my biotech industry. There's a very interesting film made by a friend, a French filmmaker, whose film has been shown all over the world. It's called The World According to Monsanto. And it's got a little footage of President Bush Sr. in the Monsanto headquarters saying, tell me what you want and I'll get it for you. And that's how these deals of corporate rule are made. Anyway, President Bush comes back, and at that point you had a vice president called Quayle. Quayle? What's his name? Quayle?
Quayle.
But I might get his
Potato.
name wrong, but he's the one who couldn't spell potato. But you know what? He could spell something called substantial equivalence. What is this? A new order was passed from government to say, we will assume that the genetically modified organism is substantially equivalent to the non-genetically modified organism. And in my view, this means a policy of don't look, don't see. Don't find. If you're going to assume it's the same, where will you look for the difference? Where will you do the test? So, the US is a big dark hole on safety assessment.
Yeah.
Big dark hole. In agriculture, I will need a little water. If there's water possible. Water, thank goodness, they haven't yet got there.
They're using it for fracking,
Yeah.
hydraulic fracking.
If they can't get, I'll take yours. But I don't want you to try. In the case of agriculture crops, the company just writes to the government to say, we know this is safe. That's it. No one tests for safety. Lots of water now. In Europe, it was a little different. Part of it is you're the ones who are stuck with a really big biotech company, which has had it had nothing to do with food, it had nothing to do with seed, but today is the biggest seed corporation of the world. Monsanto is the biggest seed corporation in the world and controls about 70% of the seed industry. In terms of numbers, they just go by, they just took over about 60 companies in India through licensing arrangements. They just go in, they've got such deep pockets. And of course you'll have deep pockets if you extract royalties everywhere. If you wonder why everyone's growing corn and soya, it's because that's where they get their royalties. So they push that. And they make sure all other alternatives go. So in Europe, let me just run through the safety studies. I think it was 1998, the UK government, because of the pressure of movements, but then I launched a GMO freeze campaign in England. The government was forced to, I was smiling because I was just thinking of the old ladies who would go into supermarkets, load, and you should do this if you don't get the label on 6th of November. Go into supermarkets, load your carts with all kinds of things, and say, well, you didn't put the label, now tell me, does this have GMO? And they have to keep running. They keep running. And the queues and queues for more. And in England, they just said, this is such a headache, we won't keep this up. We just be GMO free. So Arpit Putsai, very, very famous expert, was asked by the UK government, he was given £35 million to study the impact. Now he was not an activist, he was a scientist. He actually thought GMOs might be good, but his test showed something different. The rats that he had fed the GM potatoes to, the brain shrank, the pancreas expanded, and the entire digestive tract had ulcers. So he went to his director and said, if this is the result of 3 months feeding, what's going to happen with a lifetime of eating this stuff? So they held a press conference, and it was all over. And the story that we have heard is Monsanto called up President Clinton, and President Clinton called up Tony Blair, and Tony Blair called up the director and said, get rid of this man. His office was locked. This is the top research scientist in the field of lectins. He's shut out of his lab. A gag order was put on him. You can't talk about this. We had to do a campaign to get the parliament to remove that gag order. But he lost his job. He had migrated from Hungary. And this is what he said to the press. He said, I left Hungary because the Communist Soviet Union did not give me enough freedom. I thought I would find freedom here. But under the control of these corporations, there's less freedom here than there is back in Hungary. I'm going home. Unfortunately, he had a stroke, he's not well. We gave him a Gandhi Award for his courage and for his integrity.